Welcome back, everyone. We just got done talking about the microscopic parts of the nervous system, so the neurons and the glial cells and even the components of those. Now we're going to go for a change of pace. So now we're going to talk about the gross anatomy of the nervous system. So by gross anatomy, what we mean are the features that are visible to the naked eye, so the larger pieces of it. And there are two main, it's split in two ways that are important. There's the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system I always start with because I feel like it's a little easier to grasp. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. Boom, that's it. Brain, spinal cord, done. The peripheral nervous system are all the other parts of the nervous system found outside the skull and the spinal column, so anything but the brain and spinal cord. So it looks something like this. So you have in blue the brain and the spinal cord, that's all your central nervous system. And then you have this peripheral nervous system that goes throughout the rest of your body. So you have all this out here, that's all peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system consists of a bunch of nerves, and all nerves are bundles of axons. And there are three main components that you need to know about of the peripheral nervous system, that is. First, you have the cranial nerves, and we'll talk about this briefly in a moment. Cranial nerves connect to the brain. So cranial nerves connect to the brain. There are also spinal nerves. These are sometimes called somatic nerves, and they connect to the spinal cord. So the difference between cranial and spinal nerves, just where they connect. Cranial nerves, brain, spinal nerves, spinal cord. And there's also the autonomic nervous system, which we'll be talking about a fair amount in this lecture. The autonomic nervous system primarily controls the glands and internal organs of the nervous system. So with that, I guess the glands and organs aren't part of the nervous system, just to be clear, but they help control the glands and the internal organs. And with that, autonomic is often thought as automatic. So these are a lot of the things that just happen without you thinking about them, digestion, your heart beating, things like that, all part of the autonomic nervous system. So we'll be talking a lot more about this, as you can imagine, because all these systems greatly impact biology and behavior. So for the cranial nerves, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they're responsible for serving as the sensory and motor systems for the head and the neck. For the sake of your sanity, you don't need to know them all, but just know roughly what they do. So just kind of look through this, know roughly what they do. And also be sure to study the ones for eye movement. So you don't need to know all these. I would know these, just word to the wise. So spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal or synaptic, or why do I keep saying synaptic? Somatic nerves. And basically each one of each pair is for each side of the body. So it splits like this. So each side of the body has one of the two. And each spinal nerve is the fusion of two distinct branches or roots. So with that, you have the dorsal root, and this root carries sensory information from the body to the spinal cord. So any touch sensation like that, that's all dorsal root. It's trying to take that information, carry it to the spinal cord. The ventral root carries motor information from the spinal cord to the muscles. So, and you notice dorsal, ventral, front, back. It's actually how they're placed in the spinal cord. So the ventral root is towards your stomach, dorsal root toward your back. So that's how these nerves go. And the ventral root carries motor information from the spinal cord to the muscles. So this is why if you lose, both of these made sense. So if you have a spinal injury, you can obviously lose sensory information because you lose these neurons, the information from these neurons. And you also can lose the ability to control motor systems because that information is not getting through the ventral root to those muscles. So the spinal nerve segments are actually named for where they connect to the spinal cord. So you have cervical, lumbar. So it's all based on where these connect to the spinal cord. The actual names are not on the exam. So don't stress the actual names. Just know that the name corresponds with the segment where it connects on the spinal cord. Make sense? Okay. The autonomic nervous system, which we talked about briefly a couple slides ago, was previously thought to be fully independent of the brain, just that it would do its thing. But that's not the case. The autonomic nervous system is actually controlled by the central nervous system. Even though much of the autonomic nervous system lies outside conscious control, there are some parts of it that are under conscious control. But overall, again, it's sometimes helpful to think of it as the autonomic nervous system because, again, a lot of these things just happen, just work for us. So that's the autonomic nervous system. And it's broken down into three major divisions. You have the sympathetic, the parasympathetic, and the enteric nervous systems. Let's start with sympathetic. Sympathetic nervous system is primarily known as the nervous system that activates fight or flight response. So it upregulates. It's going to get you going. It's always active to some extent, even when you're relaxed, in order to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is critical. There's a whole chapter on it we're going to talk about. But the body wants to get to its kind of resting happy place. So sympathetic is always partially active to try to keep it in that happy place. So the parasympathetic is responsible for the opposite. It kind of does the opposite of the sympathetic. So while sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is the read or digest, or the feed and breed, because those are the things that it's responsible for. It's responsible for sexual arousal, salivation, urination, and defecation. So all the things that you don't do with fight or flight that are important for maintaining homeostasis, that's going to be parasympathetic. So as I mentioned, for many activities, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems act as opposites. And that's in part because of the neurotransmitters they use. The sympathetic nervous system uses norepinephrine, which gets things going. It's a stimulant kind of thing. Whereas the parasympathetic uses acetylcholine, which helps slow things down. So with that, they kind of antagonize each other based on the neurotransmitters. So the parasympathetic is really important for helping the body maintain and also restore homeostasis after fight or flight. So after, whatever it was passes, maybe, after that scary dog passes you on your walk in the morning, your body returns back to normal. That's the parasympathetic gearing up. So it gears up to help you slow down and get the, digestion and all that stuff going again. The enteric nervous system controls the gastrointestinal system, so stomach, intestine, things like that. So it plays a key role in maintaining the fluid and nutrient balance in the body. And it is partially controlled by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Because as you can, both, it's important for it. With sympathetic, we know that when that fight or flight gears up, it slows down digestion, so you have more blood for, your muscles. So it needs to have some control over the system. Also, again, parasympathetic is read and digest. So it needs to be able to gear up digestion. So it also has some control over this enteric nervous system. So here's just a illustration that helps you look at sympathetic and parasympathetic and the different things that they do. And what you'll notice is a lot of these things, again, are in contrast to each other. So sympathetic dilates pupils. Parasympathetic constricts pupils. Sympathetic inhibits salivation, whereas parasympathetic increases it. So you'll notice that a lot of times these things are working as antigonous, they're fighting against each other. So with that, just tend to look through, and again, when you think of fight or flight, it's going to help you with remembering what sympathetic does. So what happens with fight or flight? Well, my heart gets going, my breathing gets going, all these things. That's going to help you remember what happens with sympathetic. And for parasympathetic, just think of the opposite. When you start calming down, what happens? So hopefully that'll help you remember the difference between these two responses. So now we're going to focus on the gross anatomy of the central nervous system. Now, as you'll recall, the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the brain, as you likely know, is divided into two halves, or hemispheres, that are connected in the middle by the corpus callosum. The cerebral cortex is the outer covering of the cerebral hemispheres, and it consists largely of nerve cell bodies and their branches. And the cerebral cortex may be thought of as the complex, or no, as the seat of complex cognition. There we go. So this is where a lot of the complex thinking, executive functioning, things like that, this is where it occurs. So because of that, damage to the cortex may impair higher functioning, such as speech, memory, or visual processing. The brain's surface has two different types of areas, which you'll see here on the next slide. First of all, you have a gyrus. A gyrus is a ridged or raised portion of the surface. And you also have a sulcus. A sulcus is a furrow or indented, I guess you could say, part of the surface. So just looking, you have all these folds, and you have these raised portions and these kind of folded portions. And so again, the raised are gyrus, and the parts that are in the fold, are folded in, those are sulcus or sulci, if it's plural. So within the cortex, the cerebral cortex has four lobes that you need to know about. So the frontal lobe is in the front of the brain towards the eyes. So it's the region furthest toward the front. And it's separated from the parietal lobe by the central sulcus, which you'll see at the next slide. And it's separated from the temporal lobe by the sylvian fissure. It's responsible for reward-seeking behavior, attention, short-term memory, planning, and motivation. It also seems to be important for maintaining longer-term memories that are not based in tests. The parietal lobe is it lies between the frontal and the occipital lobes, and it's responsible for integrating sensory information from different modalities, especially in reference to space and movement. Several portions of the parietal lobe are also important for language processing and working with numbers and things of that nature. The occipital lobe is the posterior region. It's the one toward the very back. And as you may guess, it's really important for visual processing. And lastly, the temporal lobe lies kind of underneath part of the frontal and parietal, but in front of the occipital, as you'll see on the next slide. And it's going to be important for auditory processing. So here they are. So you have frontal lobe toward the front, parietal lobe here, occipital lobe toward the back, and temporal lobe down here. So just know roughly where these are and what they do. Oop, I just realized I was pointing to the wrong one. So again, you probably read it anyway, but frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. Brain tissue. Two colors of brain tissue that you need to know. White matter, gray matter. Really pretty easy differentiation. White matter consists mostly of axons with white myelin sheaths, whereas gray matter contains more cell bodies and dendrites that lack myelin. So the main difference, whether or not they're myelinated. White matter, mostly myelinated. Gray matter, mostly not myelinated. Now we're going to talk a little bit about brain orientation. You may have noticed, and you'll certainly notice throughout this book, the way the brain looks differs. The way they cut it really makes a difference, which makes some sense. So there are lots of different ways you can kind of split the brain and look at it, and also lots of ways in medicine that they describe where things are. So this is where we talk a little bit about that terminology, because it's important for knowing where things are located within the brain. So first, the different ways to kind of split up the brain. We'll use my handy dandy ruler to help kind of show this division. So first you have a sagittal plane. This dissects the brain into right and left halves. Right down the middle. Boom. You also have a coronal plane. This divides the brain into front and back. So if this was a blade, boom, right down the middle of my head, front, back. And then a horizontal plane divides the brain into upper and lower part. Boom. So lower part, upper part. So again, sagittal, coronal, horizontal. Made sense? So a couple of the little terms that are known, or that are help you know direction. Medial means towards the middle, whereas lateral means toward the side. So if you say something is lateral lateral to the hippocampus, that means it's toward the side of the brain, away from the middle of the brain. So it helps you locate, oh, that's there, gotcha. Ipsilateral. Ipsilateral is the same side, whereas contralateral is the opposite side. This is important because most parts of the brain are on both sides. So you need to know which side we're talking about. Anterior or rostral versus posterior and caudal. This is where it starts getting confusing between humans and animals. I'll try to make this as clear as possible. So anterior is the head end, so top part. Rostral, tail end. So for us, it's actually toward the feet, because, you try to think which end is the tail end, so toward the feet. This will get confusing when we get to the next slide and talk about dorsal. Just rostral toward the feet. Dorsal is kind of, well, you'll see. Just rostral down. Anterior or rostral up. Did I say that right? Let's do it again. Anterior or rostral, head end. Posterior or caudal, down. Cool? Proximal is toward the center. Distal, towards the periphery. So again, just go over these terms, make sure you know them, because they're going to be really helpful when it comes to figuring out where these brain parts are located. Here we go, dorsal and ventral. So ventral, towards the belly or the front. Dorsal, toward the back. Now, sometimes dorsal gets confused with being toward the feet. It's not. It's toward the back. So the way I think of this is dolphins. Dolphins have a dorsal fin. Where would the dorsal fin be on you? It'd be in the middle of your back, right? So that's the dorsal side. It's not toward the feet, toward the back. And then there are two descriptions of information flow, I guess you'd say. Afferent and efferent. Afferent carries information to an area of interest, whereas efferent carries it away. So let's say it's in reference to the brain. Afferent would take it to, efferent would take it away. So afferent goes at it. So here's just another, hopefully, helpful image to help you figure out which is which. But so here you have how things are split. So again, you have your sagittal, coronal, horizontal plane. Same with the brain. And then dorsal and ventral. And this is where, again, this is going to get confusing. So let's talk about this again. So rostral, which I think I misspoke on once, so just be sure you get this right. Rostral is toward the front. Okay? Caudal, toward the back. Again, think of if someone's lying on their belly. So this is like toward, I shouldn't say back, toward the feet. So this is this part of the brain that's like, well, this is not the right view to look at, but toward your feet if you're laying down. Dorsal, toward the top of the head. Now again, think of just your head. Oh, why do I keep drawing on the wrong one? I'm sorry about this. Okay. So rostral, toward the front. We have caudal, toward the back. Again, think of someone laying on their stomach. So their back would be up here. So this is the dorsal. This would be where their feet would be. This would be the caudal. And rostral up here. So rostral, caudal, dorsal. So dorsal in the brain is towards the top. But if you're standing, it would be toward the back. Kind of confusing, I know. You can tell it's hard for me even to describe. So if you have questions, let me know. I'm more than happy to go over this again. Just be sure you get it before you take the quiz. So again, rostral or anterior toward the front of the brain. Caudal or posterior toward the back. And then dorsal toward the top. Cool? And then this is different ways of cutting the brain too. So this is a horizontal plane. So you notice there's not a dorsal because it's splitting it in half. So this is looking at just half of the brain, either the upper or the lower. This should be the lower, or the upper rather. So you also have a sagittal plane, which is again cutting it down the middle. So you have just one hemisphere. So you do have a dorsal. And the coronal plane, cutting it front to back, so you could look at either the front or the back of the brain. Made sense? Okay, let's see if there's anything else I need to tell you. I think that's about it. So again, let me know if you have any questions. Email me if you have any questions on this. Just review it, make sure it made sense, because it is kind of confusing.